Hello and welcome to the Blockchain and Us, where pioneers and thought leaders talk about their journey in blockchain technology, crypto assets, and the token economy. And I'm your host, Manuel Staggers. This episode has support from my very own The Blockchain and Us newsletter. Get an email from me every 2 weeks with a very short summary of new podcast episodes so you can immediately pick those interviews you'd like to listen to. To stay up to date, just visit www.theblockchainandus.com and sign up today. My guest today is Monique Morrow. Monique is the president and co-founder of the Humanized Internet, a non-profit organization providing digital identity through blockchain technology. She is the former Services CTO of Cisco, where she helped transition the company from hardware to software. And among many other things, she is an associated researcher at the Humboldt University's Institute of Internet and Society, the co-chair of the IEEE Ethics in AI and Autonomous Systems Mixed Reality Committee, an advisor to the Cybersecurity Sparklabs, and to VETRI, a blockchain-enabled personal data management platform. And now, to the conversation with Monique Morrow. Hi, Monique, and many thanks for taking time today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Manuel.
Monique, you have been working with technology for decades as an engineer and CTO all around the world. Let's maybe begin with what you find so fascinating about blockchains.
Well, first and foremost, I like to walk the talk. So I think it's also understanding where the provenance of blockchains come from, especially if we're talking about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. So I think it's important to actually put them together and look at what we're thinking about when we look at the peer-to-peer internet of value that is so proselytized if you think in blockchain technology itself. So what I find about it is that we're actually in the nascent states of what can be termed as an internet of value. And for me, blockchain, which is one of the technologies associated with the so-called Bitcoin and crypto environment, is all about this distributed ledger, distributed databases, if you want to call that is very much has the we'll say attributes of being immutable, the attributes of being, that is consensus, often consensus based. It is also one that where you can, it's transparent, and therein lies some interesting polarities, because you're, on one hand, you're dealing with immutability, you're dealing with transparency. On the other hand, you have to look at it's also pseudonymous when we're talking about exchanges of values and keys and so on. And there's a polarity between anonymity and privacy. What I find very, very interesting, where I see the low-hanging fruit, is the promise of credentialing. And credentialing, when we talk about diplomas, when we talk about land titles, credentialing is already here today. So you can't put that hat back into the box. It's already existing. In fact, I'm part of a cross-industry team looking at a problem. We were actually winners, 2018 winners from MIT Solve for Health, front lines of healthcare.
Cool. Congrats.
This past year. Thank you very, very much. And so the issue here the narrative was, how can we use these technologies? We got a caregiver shortage globally. Caregivers being nurses, people who take care of you at the elderly level, and so on. I mean, just caregivers, you can define the mental health caregivers. So there is a shortage globally. And so we took a use case as a group of us to say, why not go into, let's say, Jordan, and work with not only with UNHCR, but also with the Jordanian government, and look at how we actually close out the caregiver shortage, at least at a national level. Now, bear in mind, what it would mean is working with refugees and also Jordanian citizens. So when you meet refugees, and I have met refugees, most of them, if not all of them, really want to work. And so credentialing at a source, even though they may have lost their certificates or diplomas, there is the capability of providing a predictor examination that would assert or determine whether or not you have studied some level of caregiving or nursing. And then the next step would be to actually provide you a credential certificates. And so the thing that's important.
So sorry to interrupt there quickly, just to make sure I understand. So basically, first you basically need an exam, right? Somebody comes to you and says, I'm a caregiver. And then you have to test them whether they actually know what they're talking about?
Well, assume that they don't have their papers.
Right.
So, I mean, we're looking at two sides of a problem set here. One is, if you're looking at the refugee community, they may not have their diplomas, but they may have studied it. I mean, so for example, how do you get your diploma at the University of Aleppo if it's been destroyed? Okay, so you may have it, you may not have it. The other part of it, so let's focus on the refugees as examples. And so with the Caregiver for Nurses group, which is international, there is a predictor exam that's provided to determine it, to see if you really, there's a lot of determination in this exam that to assess whether or not you have studied caregiving. And then, of course, the next level, yes or no, the next level would be to provide sets of credentials, right? And credentials in the form of certificates, diplomas. It may be that you may have to study further in a nearby university, may not be. But these credentials will be actually time-stamped and actually posted, if you will, on the blockchain. From a caregiver, from a person who receives that credential or that certification, and it's posted on the blockchain, that person doesn't care about the technology. What that person cares about is it going to be recognized by if a person is going to exit out of the country and be received, let's say, by Switzerland or by another country, would they recognize it? And the reason why this is an important issue is because what happens when refugees resettle, they come to another country, they want to work, they want to go and resume their professional career, but they end up paying 50, 60,000 euros at a minimum to recertify, which puts them on the social welfare system most often.
About how many people do you think need this kind of service?
Well, it depends. I mean, I just gave an example that is a narrow use case, right, on certification. But if you're looking at identity, for those who don't have it, you're looking at least there's. The numbers can go from 1.1 billion. They can go to 65 million. They can go to 10 million if you're a stateless individual, so you don't have any identity per se. And credentialing is an aspect that can be used in this particular case when we're talking about blockchain. So the numbers are very high depending on which. We always start with 1.1 billion. It's often quoted. But look, people, here's the thing. We talk about refugees. That's one thing. We talk about natural disasters. That's another thing. You could wake up one morning, Manuel, and everything is destroyed by fire. I mean, look at what's happening in California, for example, or flooding or whatever. So blockchain, what the interesting thing here is that you can actually reference when it's time-stamped, because there's also a time-stamp correlation. I know it because one of the things that I'm doing is I'm finishing up a master's degree in digital currency at the University of Nicosia. It was the first university to offer that since 2014. MIT and Princeton University are along those lines. Other universities that are global are doing the same thing, right? So clearly, credentialing, and when a institution can provide you that certification, which is great, then that, because that actually proves that you didn't falsify a certificate, even better. But then what happens if the institution no longer exists for whatever reason? You have to go through some level of a predictor examination to assess whether or not you have those skill sets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. Interesting. I'd like to ask a little bit more about identity specifically, because you also have a nonprofit, the Humanized Internet.
Yep.
Where you advocate for a blockchain-based identity. What does your work consist of there?
So there are three areas that the humanized internet cares about. So let me level up the conversation here. One is around the liberty of identity, because so let me just say, one is liberty of identity for those who don't have it. The second one is about the question of whether or not you are in control of your identity. That's you and I both, and do you care? And the third is about ethics. What does ethics look like in technology, and does ethics carry value? So if we go back to the identity issue, we should all have control of our identity, and countries should recognize that identity. At this moment, I'll give you a number. For example, 10 million people are not recognized. 10 million. Rohingyas are in that category because they don't have control of their identity, as an example. So if we look at follow the narrative, if you live in a country where there is war and you have to leave immediately, or imagine all your stuff gets lost in an earthquake or a fire. Most people leave with nothing at best or at worst. And I would think, it doesn't matter, for example, my important documents are kept on a Google Drive. One of the people who sits on my board is a refugee, and that's what happened to him. It didn't matter in his particular case that he had copies of his papers on a Google Drive. So immigration officers, for example, don't recognize these documents in its digital form. So you have to. So I think you have to change the system. You have to look at identity that corresponds maybe to some kind of member state that should be portable, because without it, you're nothing. It has to be something portable to you. In fact, I just reviewed a paper where somebody is actually going to the EU and looking at a permission-based identity system where there would be keys given and identity cards given, and where the individual could share what he or she wants to share as they're passing through countries. So what I'd like to solve for is, blockchain could be an answer here, but there are various other technologies. What I'm looking at is a harder problem, and and especially something I talk about quite often, is to think about a portable digital safe trésor, right? And it's persistent to you. So, for example, I keep documents maybe at a vault in a bank or whatever, and I have keys. And maybe the bank has a key. But think about it in its digital form, that you have digital keys, or members of your family have digital keys, and they're shared amongst devices. And you can assume that device may be a phone or an iPad or something of that nature. And it's portable to you. It's not held into a cloud. Storage is a hard problem here. It's not by any third party, because what we know is that third party, anything that's centralized, will be hacked. And so there are some groups, some universities with whom we're working to look at and solve for that level of a problem. In fact, it goes to the second form of whether or not you're in control of your identity and do you care. Sir Tim Berners-Lee is looking at, a similar project with regard to the world, redesigning the web. And this is a project out of MIT that he's actually advocating for, which is called Solid, which is really looking at you having portability of your identity sets. And so this is the, and to the third point, if anything, ethics is like the big major, I would say, major standard that people are holding companies to, and you don't have to look far away to assess, to determine whether or not that's true. If you look at some of the sloppiness of how data has been handled or mishandled in most cases.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an interesting topic, and we could do a whole podcast just about ethics, I think.
Absolutely.
But first, I have some more questions about identity, because
sure.
We spoke before about it. I had an interesting conversation a few months back with Steve Wilson from Constellation Research, and he thinks that electronic identity and blockchain technology won't go together, because basically he said humans are real assets, quote unquote, and you cannot put real assets on a blockchain. Just makes no sense. So what would you say to somebody who has that opinion?
Well, I mean, so we're mixing apples and oranges a little bit, right? You don't put everything on a blockchain. And by the way, What I'm looking at is something even further than that. So it's this whole notion of you could use blockchain. I mean, I just reviewed a document where you could use blockchain to actually have a permission set of identity. For example, what is it that I choose to share? Okay, and that could be recognized by governments, and that may be it may be something like a name. It may be something that that I'm going to share. At the best, I wouldn't put DNA on my blockchain, for example, or any blockchain. So the blockchain for me is about credentialing more than anything else. I'm looking at more of digital. I'm looking at the promise, and that may not be with blockchain, the promise of a digital, almost a real-time apostille that could be provided.
An apostille is basically a certification by a government body that something is correct.
So let me give you an example. The Humanized Internet is a Swiss-based nonprofit. I have a co-founder based in Toronto, and I have a member of the board who is a refugee based in Berlin. Now, my lawyers, the lawyers who are Swiss-based, said, "Look, we want to start this entity up." So we had to DHL papers to my co-founder in Toronto. He had to get an apostille seal. There's no Swiss consulate in Toronto. It's DHL to Montreal, back to him, signed, and it's back to Switzerland. I'm thinking all of this DHL, we're in the 21st century, we could use some other thing.
Well, DHL is great, though. I'm sorry to interrupt there, because I had to get an apostille in Japan recently. And there you have to show up in person, that's even worse.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, well, yes. And so that's, you can do things like KYC with your phone. You could do some levels of biometrics and so on. Blockchain, for me, the thing of it is there are certain sets of what you're going to carry. We know that the device that's often used, the device as a tool for the citizen or for you and I, is a phone. It's either mobile, even it doesn't matter. It's usually a phone, and so you could have sets of biometrics that that are used for you to lock that phone. And you're carrying digital instantiations of what it is that is important for you, whether it's health records or whatever. It's you, and of course with digital keys. And the key part is cryptographic, right? That part is associated with often associated with blockchain, but digital sets of keys that you certainly will have. You could also have a public key that may be something that a government or an organization will have. And so that gets towards this level of where does blockchain fit into in terms of e-sovereignty or I'll call it, there's digital identity and then there's the notion of e-sovereignty. And so, and what entities are going to recognize X and provenance of it. So what we're talking about in the case of, your colleague, the colleague from Constellation, is it's always trying to prove provenance of something. And blockchain has the promise to do that. It certainly does. It's absolutely, you can go back to the Genesis block. You can go back years. I mean, we just celebrated, what is it, 10 years of just Bitcoin. Bitcoin itself, or the peer-to-peer system of value. Which, by the way, has years before that, when you're looking at Satoshi Nakamoto, years before that in terms of development. So what we're talking about is not pie in the sky. It absolutely is possible and pertinent today. The question to ask is, are there problems in the system that we have today? And I will say that there is. And if you're not in the system, here's the problem. If you're not in the system, you are going to be subjected to human trafficking, right? That's the second most lucrative business next to drug trafficking. And so we have to think out of the box on how do we use these technologies to create something that is relatively immutable, has properties of privacy that you can share, and how you share it, and have some notion of a digital apostille that can be given to you near real time.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one question I always have, and maybe one thing I don't quite understand yet about all of this is, let's say somebody loses everything, right? They have a fire, everything burns, the papers, the phone, everything.
Mm-hmm.
So they still need their private key, though.
So yeah, they would have to have their private key. That's true. I mean, at today's use of the sets of technologies, your wallet is closed, or your phone is closed. But on the other hand, it's looking at what you have. This is the promise. What you could actually create in its digital instantiation that is in another, what I'll call safe boxes that are digital. And so that could solve very well some of the problems that we're seeing.
How do you reconcile the fact, that you still have to trust someone? And of course, before you mentioned some of the attributes of blockchains, decentralized, censorship resistance, but also trustless. And here always, I think, with this identity discussion, somebody has to be a trusted counterparty who actually makes that entry onto a blockchain. So I'm just wondering sometimes if we don't introduce a weak link there.
No, okay. I mean, so the thing of it is what is trust, right? So you here's the thing. If we break it down a little bit, if we break it down to why value? Why do you have sort of this notion of? I want to talk about sort of Bitcoin as an example. It was, if you think about when Satoshi Nakamoto's paper came out, it was 2008. I think we were talking about a banking crisis then. And you can do your data and homework and look at how many people trust banks, right? So trustless. So you have to think about sort of, you let this entity, you work on the internet, but you see the people behind it? No, you don't. You don't have to, because it just works. I mean, you were in this environment before. I mean, you are in this environment. It just works. You don't have to. And that takes a lot of, I would say to some extent when we're talking about blockchain credentialing and having these nonsense of truth, there's certain things that you have to look at, or how do you deal with gaming, preventing or tackling something where the system can be gamed. How do you deal with consensus, consensus can be consensus based? I think we're probably 20% there from a governance perspective. I mean, that's why it's all nascent. You have to look at, the whole notion of distributed entities. I think where it's experimental at this point in time. What is trustless? And so I think what we have to think about is somewhere in the middle, right? It's not, you've got an extreme libertarian view that says, let the system just decide for itself. I'm not advocating that. And I'm not advocating world citizenship. I'm advocating something in between. But most important, I believe we are in a Copernican revolution where the citizen has to be in the center. Not the other way around, where you have these entities that are non-transparent, that are opaque, and you don't know what's happening with your data, and you don't know what's happening with your identity, and you're not in control. The thing of it is that we are dealing with a trust deficit, right? It's not trustless versus trust. We're dealing with a lack of trust.
Exactly.
so and that's what you have to address.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, where do you see blockchain technology or distributed ledgers? Where do you see them sit, on a spectrum maybe with other disruptive technologies like data storage, data analytics, AI, robotics, drones? Where do you think blockchains fit in there?
Look, they are... This for me is going back to what is associated with an internet of value overall. So I would say that very much a key technology component. They will fit in, when you look at blockchain and also this whole notion of artificial intelligence. By the way, with artificial intelligence, I will take a different view. I think that I would think one of the things that I've been arguing about, which is tangentially related to our conversation, which is about where does it all fit for the future of work. I do think that drones, when you democratize drones, I think we have a small, very, very interesting polarity between democratization of all of these wonderful technologies to mass empowerment. I can use these technologies to do wonderful things for myself, but I can also do bad things, right? I can do evil things, and so mass destruction. So is that little spider in your shower a spider, or is it a drone with anthrax? So and that exists. I mean, this is the thing about it is that we need to be very responsible. And that goes to technology has no agency, but it's not going to prevent people from being malevolent. We have just bad characters and bad actors in this world, but we have to be extremely responsible. And when we create this technology, you have to look at declaring it to actually identify what its needs are, or what its uses are, and at least be cognizant of cognitive bias and recognize it, because who is creating the technology, what kinds of groups, and for what purpose. So that's very, very important. And when I get into so blockchain's going to be blockchain's already there. Internet of Values there. I think all of that is just this is very, very key. Artificial drones, it exists. I think flying cars are going to be interesting. I think people are already talking about portable MRIs, which is interesting in itself, because then you get into telepathy and I can read your thoughts, right? So we can get way far ahead about where these technologies are going. One of the things I wanted to say is about artificial intelligence. Much is said about, this gets into the work environment, because much is said about, all of this stuff is going to do away with, kill jobs. I think the thing of it is that if we look at where we're at, our work, the way work is defined is that you're a cost. It's a task-based economy. You've got a wave where you have a gig economy. And the third one that we are talking about as a group of people is the people-centered economy. And we just actually wrote a people-centered economy and ecosystem. Instead of having a zero-sum game, you could use artificial intelligence to say, look, Manuel, we're going to give you the job that is fitted for you. You're going to earn much more money. And, by the way, you're going to work with people you like, and we're going to take a commission for it. And so it becomes an earning level of technology. And for those jobs that are undesirable, that's what you use robots for. So it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game.
Let's take a quick break for a message from our sponsors. This episode has support from my very own The Blockchain and Us newsletter. Get an email from me every 2 weeks with a very short summary of new podcast episodes, so you can immediately pick those interviews you'd like to listen to. To stay up to date, just visit www.theblockchainandus.com and sign up today. I'm just wondering, because I often see it in conversations that I have with people who started, with blockchain technology, with a blockchain startup in, let's say 2016, 17. And now they're already on to integrating that technology into some kind of distributed data storage, cloud mixed with blockchain, AI somehow thrown in there as well. So I see, the whole notion of blockchain technology morph into bigger contexts. That's why I was asking.
Yes, I mean it's part of already a new levels of architecture, right? And so it's you can take it to the Internet of Things, to look at sources of your ecosystem of suppliers. You can look at it from a healthcare perspective. I'm even looking at it from an insurance perspective, insurtech and blockchain. So the sky's the limit here when you look at the promises of blockchain in the industry today. And moving to the future, because now you're looking at closing out all of these silos, and people are looking at distributed ledgers where you can see absolutely the interesting transactions that are occurring, and And specifically when we talk about healthcare, I can look at where my data is going and determine which doctor I want to share my data with, right? I can see those transactions. And I think that that's the promise of what we have in blockchain by industries per se.
Interesting. Well, there's definitely many promises, I think, that all of these technologies can have. And I have a question about that as well, because I read on your website that you had a big role in pivoting Cisco, where you were CTO, to the Internet of Things and cloud computing. So I'm wondering how did you see that IoT and cloud would be beneficial to get involved with?
I mean, this is so when you're part of a group, when you're looking at, you have to look at what can disintermediate your business model, right? So it was always taken for granted that the network was table stakes. Cloud computing has had different forms. I mean, we were calling it grid computing at one point in time, right? And so certainly when we looked at the promise of cloud, of storage, and the Internet of Things, particularly in terms of sensors, in terms of being able to provide for objects that are intelligible and addressable objects. For Cisco, what was very key was that it had all kinds of implications to the network. So the network became table stakes, and so this was just a way to grow the value into other areas, like cloud computing, like the Internet of Things, always bringing value to the network per se and moving up the stack. So moving something that became programmable at the application layer.
But wasn't there kind of an innovator's dilemma that the leaders in a space fail to implement or deploy new technologies because they eat into their current revenue streams? Wasn't that an issue with Cisco there as well?
Well, there's definitely at some point in time, you have to think about, which is an art of eating your old, cannibalizing your old to grow your young, right? And so, it's sort of, if you believe that you were always going to make the 65% margins and what it is that you've always made 65% margins, anything that would have the optics of disintermediating your business was always, not always, but certainly there was pushback. And so fortunately there were people within the company that could see it, could see other possibilities. But when you're operating with these types of margins, you've got to be able to pivot and pivot fast. And so that's the thing. At which point do you say, okay, we're going to now pivot to a new model? And Cisco, to its credit, is doing that now. I mean, they've been sort of redefining themselves. They're focusing more on security. Anything that we talk about, blockchain and artificial intelligence as a security and privacy table stakes area around it. So that's absolutely very, very key. And I think that becomes important, is that know when you're pivoting, know when you should. And innovator's dilemma is, it doesn't have to be. Let me just say this about when I was in the company. We made a lot of money, Manuel, off of complexity. The art here, and with complexity comes increase in prices. But the art here is to be able to hide complexity and make it very, very attracting, if you will, from a mass adoption potential perspective. You don't want to go down the price war, but you really want to make it, you cannot be complex. It cannot be so complex that your grandmother wouldn't understand it. But we had for many years made a lot of revenues off of complexity, and customers were now shifting to say, look, we need simplicity. We need, something that is going to be pertinent for us to understand from our business model perspective. So yeah, there was certainly an innovator's dilemma. I would say attribute to some of these discussions around pivots and when to pivot. And, what happens is that when you're not agile, you started seeing startups coming up, and startups are generally very agile, and a whole bunch of startups coming up, and soon enough you your margins were being eaten into very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's exactly, I think, what's happening currently in the blockchain and crypto space, right? I mean, why aren't the banks developing and deploying this technology at scale?
Well, first of all, that's a longer discussion. But first of all, when you're talking about crypto space and block, first of all, they have Ripple, so they do talk with one another using a proprietary sort of with XRP protocol. You have to understand that when you're talking about Bitcoin and whatever the basket of 3,000 cryptocurrencies are these days, you're talking about creating value that that scares the banks. They're afraid of a 15-year-old person in some country, name your country of choice, who's mining value, right? And there certainly is no bank involved, and so you have to take these institutions along the journey. You cannot say, for example, you're going to be you're not going to exist anymore. You're going to be pertinent. You've got to take them along the journey. Maybe the equivalent is when I was working years ago at Swisscom, and I remember Cisco coming in, basically telling the CEO that voice would be free, and that was his cash cow.
Mm-hmm.
And fundamentally, he said, "You don't understand my business. For every service you go to the bank, they're charging you X percentage of whatever fee because they're charging you for the existence of their administration." Now, the thing of it is that banks have to look at how it is they're going to be relevant to their customers and continued relevance, right? We're not. I think it is an interesting time for banks and for institutions, and whether or not they are certainly using blockchain. This was a fintech, and the way they want to and certainly the insurance industry, the way they want to close out ledgers with one another. But the question now is, what is the benefit do you and I get as a consumer or as a customer? So they have been sort of testing the waters a bit, but what is the benefit that it gives to you and I? So, for example, if I am paid a certain currency that comes out of, let me give you an example. I'm paid something that came out of a currency from Oman, right? And my bank is in Switzerland. Why would it take a week to 2 weeks to clear? And that's where, as a customer, you should improve the experience. So certainly, blockchain is that cat's out of the box. I mean, that's not going to go away. Internet of Value is not going to go away. There are some things for every technical problem. There'll be a technical solution. There's wonderful things that are happening to address some of the issues around anonymity and privacy, et cetera. Great thought people coming together on that. And I think that it's just going to get bigger and better.
Mm-hmm. But still, do you think blockchain technology is somehow more difficult than perhaps other technologies like cloud computing for these big incumbents to wrap their heads around?
I think it depends. The answer is it depends. I think they need to understand how it relates to their business, where it's going to fit in their business architecture, where it's going to fit for their customers, and what value it will bring. Just because it's a technology called blockchain doesn't mean anything unless they can absolutely apply one or two or three use cases where they see its value. Having said that, you could get into what you've alluded to earlier, which is the innovator's dilemma. Just don't disturb the ship. It's been great, but we've heard that before, right? We've heard it before with Kodak. I mean, there are wonderful examples in history. History is always hindsight, where people just said forget it. And I think the thing of it is that we have to. They're going to have to. Enterprises are going to have to look at its value, and they are. To be fair, a lot of them are looking at it. Not only that, there's all kinds of industries that are absolutely not just looking at it. They're actually providing sandboxes and MVPs, minimal viable products, and pilots. I would say we are in early days when we're talking about the mass adoption, if you want to call it, for blockchain. It's this, it's now applying it to your business architecture and making sure, and I think this is most important, that value is brought with security and with privacy to its customers.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Monique, how do you keep current on technology?
Well, I mean, there's the formal side of it, I believe learning is lifelong, and so finishing up this master's degree, which is great. I like to understand what I don't know, which is very, very important. Applying it is very important. I also believe that you have sort of when I travel, I also look at, and I travel globally, I also look at where the potential so I'm an observer too. I like to ask questions, lots of questions, where there is a potential for interesting disintermediation in the market. And I learn from others. I think there's, it's both, it's just constantly putting yourself out of your comfort zone, whether it's formal, informal, and of course in writing books. So like you.
Yeah. Book writing is a good one. If you don't understand something, write a book about it.
Absolutely.
Somebody told me once. Do you have mentors as well?
I have a professional coach. Actually she and I were working together whilst we were at Cisco. Cisco is formalizing coaching to its credit, and we're continuing our relationship. So coaching is really, really important, and I think it's lifelong. I see value in professional coaching. I would say that I believe in reverse mentoring. So I have people in universities working with me, for example, not the other way around necessarily, because I like to walk in the shoes of somebody who sees the world different in a different light, and that for me is really, really cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, there is this idea that senior executives should have something like 15-year-olds as tech mentors. And
Absolutely.
I think that's a great idea. Yeah.
Absolutely.
You mentioned before you've also, you've been working in Asia a lot. And I mean, I also lived in Asia for several years. And of course, I mean, there are huge differences in how people use technologies there in comparison to Europe and to the United States. How do you think, a place like Switzerland, for example, can keep up with what's happening in Asia?
Well, okay, so that's how I'm going to answer that question. I think, I lived in Hong Kong. I had half the world as my responsibility. So I was constantly in a plane, and I can tell you things happen fast. I mean, really, 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 really fast. So you got speed, and you got the properties of speed. And especially when we talk about China, and scale, when you put China and India together, right? And so I think that becomes very interesting. In terms of Switzerland, from my perspective, I believe Switzerland has positioned itself very well. I mean, they have an appetite. You have 26 cantons. There is an appetite to experiment at least at a canton level, at least at the federal government level. I think we're getting into, what does all of this technology mean from perspective of adding value to its citizens. I think that's important to note. When I take a particular, some examples, parliamentarians want to understand what it means. What is blockchain? What do these technologies mean for its citizens? They don't, so as not to over-rotate in regulatory policies. So I think there is an appetite. I think Switzerland, one of the things that Switzerland can do is to think about going a little faster, especially if you're comparing with these other countries. So there is sort of there's caution, but there's also how fast can you go to create a sandbox of what I'll call experimentation, such that if you fail, okay, you fail, and you have learnings and you go on with it, right? So I think it's more that than anything else. But certainly you've got wonderful schools. You've been a product of ATH, APFL. I mean, it was super schools and super education. I just think that there is an entrepreneurial spirit that is fantastic, and I think it's just a matter of looking at, not necessarily measuring itself. And I think that's the challenge against these huge countries or whatever, but looking at how a country like Switzerland can actually fuel these technologies to create and spawn even more and more interesting innovation, such that it becomes a model as a country of Switzerland. The Swiss brand carries a lot of weight, and so it really does. So I think that it's just, for me, when I look at it, I think they could probably take a little more risk in some of the cases.
Yeah, definitely. And before we spoke about electronic identity, and I mean, I've been wondering for the longest time why Switzerland doesn't have an electronic identity yet, because it's a small enough country to deploy something like this. You have already some kind of decentralized government, so it would make sense to have a ledger that is somewhat distributed. I mean, why do you think they don't have something like a blockchain identity yet here?
Well, I think and it's interesting. I mean, sometimes it's often compared to, sort of Estonia, which has been experimental. I have an Estonian ID card. I think that a lot of it, and is sort of getting there with the Swiss pass or ID pass or whatever, the sort of getting into, I think it's just, first and foremost, what's really, really important is that the citizen needs to understand what its value is, right? And you just can't say, okay, we're going to give you a Swiss ID, we're going to give you this card and be done with it. I think the Swiss citizen needs to understand, well, okay, what does it mean to me? What is the value? How do I use it? What kind of education do they need? Et cetera, et cetera. I mean, so it's more about that. I do think that it's interesting when you look at some of the way cards are used and passports are given. It's still, I think there is a promise for having digital identity. I do believe Switzerland has I think there's an appetite to produce that. But what's important is that it's got to be understood by citizens. And that goes to any technology in its output. And that's just not in Switzerland. That's just overall.
Yeah, interesting point. Do you sometimes have doubts, about where technology is taking us as humans?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have alluded to it. And I think that there is a fine line between what technology, there is a fine line between the powerful use of technology and the negative use of it. And I think that if we're not careful, what will happen is we could be so overrun by, I'm not so overrun, but I think it'll be much more intrusive than we care to have it to be. And I think that what's important is that there's got to be a social value to what we create. So this gets always into this embedded ethics, yes or no. I want to be able to think yes or no, and beyond 240 characters and so on and so forth. I don't believe that just digitalization equals coding in schools. I think it's more also the value of being able to think and to think beyond just swiping iPads. Because I have spoken to Swiss teachers here, and they're very concerned about the attention span of students, right? Yeah. And I did speak to a provost at a university in the Arab Emirates, and he fundamentally said, "I just want students to ask a question." So I do. So that's just to its impact to you, that we're getting so much information. But I do believe in the promise that of this great technology. There is this promise. But we do have to be careful of its terrible abuse moving forward. Just to be careful of the both sides of the coin, because it's getting again with drones and with which is very interesting and carries value, especially when we're talking about avalanches and all kinds of things when you can find or when you can actually carry care packages like in Rwanda. There's huge amount of value to it. But again, if you're democratizing something that carries so much value that could be misused at the citizen level, where the response is mass surveillance.
How big do you think the risk is that something like this could happen? Some kind of dystopia scenario.
Well, some of it is already happening, and I mean, you've got countries that have basically so at a nation state level. China and the Russian Federation has basically asserted that the country that is the AI leader will own the world, right? And so for example, China, mass surveillance is a given. And there is there's a determination to get points for good behavior as you're surveilled, but also points are deducted and so on and so forth. And citizens accept it. But again, that may be dystopian to you and I, right? And I think that's the thing that we're looking at is what is if you have that level of mass surveillance, then you're looking at what is war or destruction look like in our time, and it could be very, very concerning. I mean, disconcerting levels of biowarfare. And so on and so forth. But again, there is no reason we're living longer. So why not, if people are going to live to 100 or 200 years old or whatever the magic number is, then that's great too. You have longevity. But I think that there's a pretty close dystopian view of what it is we're doing, if I can read your thoughts.
Yeah, I often wonder, how real all of this is, because always I think people have been afraid of the future. And, the more I think about it, the more I research also in this space, the more optimistic actually I get, I have to say. It's just my personal view.
Don't get me wrong. I'm optimistic. I'm cautiously optimistic, right? I really am. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I think it's incumbent upon us to communicate responsible uses of technology.
Monique, what are you learning at the moment, maybe in terms of not formal knowledge, but as a human?
Apart from formal knowledge, I'm going back into history. Looking at I like to read a bit of history. I always believe hindsight is sort of 20/20. So certainly in terms of how technologies in the past have been used in terms of manipulating people, that's an interesting thing. Certainly in terms of understanding, for example, when I look at when I look at the system, why is it? I ask questions. Why is it that we have to retire at age 55 or 65? That is from von Bismarck, right? What century was von Bismarck in? We just our systems haven't caught up, right? I like to parrot I'm learning around questions about why is insurance so expensive, just because of what group you're in. And so I like to be an observer. So a lot of it is reading history. A lot of it is understanding what is broken around some of the areas that seem obviously broken, and learning new languages. So I think that's important to constantly keep yourself challenged.
Okay, cool. What's next for the humanized internet?
The digital lockbox. I think that's a really, really important area to work on. I keep talking about that persistence of digital lockbox, this issue of storage that's persistent to you, where you have keys that are shared. We're talking about a fire amongst shared devices. I think this is really a big problem to solve for.
Monique, this was great.
It's been a great conversation, Manuel. We could go on and on and on. I love it.
Yeah, there were so many verticals we could have branched out, but maybe another time, I hope.
I do.
Monique, I really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot for taking time.
Likewise.
Thanks so much for joining us today. More info on our guests and our sponsors is in the show notes of this episode and on the podcast website, theblockchainandus.com. To help people find this podcast, it's important that you download, subscribe, and give it a top rating and review on iTunes or on the podcast platform of your choice. I'm Manuel Staggers, and I thank you very much for listening.